Welcome. It's Ary Rosenbaum here with another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. Going to talk to Reid from Q3 Asset Management for this week's podcast, and it's our 75th podcast, which is hard to believe that still going strong at 75. Of course, before we get Greg on, as always, it's time for me to shill for my events. We're still about a month away, less than a month away, to that 401k National Conference. Walt Disney World Swan, March 10th to 11th, 2020. Ron Duguay's our guest, Goose Gossage, lots of great presentations, discount Disney tickets. Rooms are still available, hopefully, at the block rate of $275 per night. Go to that 401ksite.com for further information. In addition, of course, our first regional event for 2020 will be in Big H, Houston, Texas. Minute Maid Park, I'm sure you've heard a thing or two about the Astros, but we'll be there on Friday, April 17th with a game that night. I promise no trash can banging during the event. It's going to be a fun event. We should be booking the guests pretty soon. Hope all of you can make it. We have people signing up and people are really showing interest in a city that I've never been to, which I'm certainly looking forward to. After April 17th, May the 8th will be in St. Louis, Missouri, another city I've never been to. Busch Stadium, game against the Mets that night. Of course, as always, stadium tour. We'll have a special guest. And if you want to go to the game that night, we'll try to make it happen for you. And last but not least, for the spring, June the 5th, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Target Field. Looking forward to that one. Again, I've never been to Minnesota. My daughter has been wanting to go to the Mall of America for the last 6 or 7 years, so we're going to make that happen for her. But that's different from our event, which, of course, Twins game that night, Twins guest. Great stadium tour. Looking forward to it. Obviously now I wouldn't be holding an event in Minnesota, but come June, it should be a lot of fun. And then, of course, we'll be booking, events for September, October, November, and December. I've talked to cities in all four. Trying to do Vegas in December, but like I tell people, the new Raider Stadium wanted a $20,000 minimum food order, so that wasn't going to happen because my events alone don't cost that much. But anyway, go to that 4ksite.com for further information. Please sign up. Again, these events are a lot of fun, great networking opportunities. You'll learn a thing or two if you're a 401k advisor. If you're another plan provider, TPA, whatnot, please feel free to sponsor. The sponsorships start as low as $500, which gives you, a ticket to the event. Great time to network. Great time to give a 3 or 4 minute speech about what you do. So, again, go to that 401ksite.com for further information. Thanks. And welcome, Greg Reid from Q3 Asset Management. Greg, how are you?
I'm good, Ary. How are you?
Can't complain. Tell me a little bit about yourself, how you started out in the retirement plan business, and where you are today.
That's a good question. Many years, I worked for a registered investment advisor, and years ago, with another investment advisor, we worked through financial advisors. So we're a money manager, and we had financial advisors who came to us and said, "Can you manage money, or can you manage 401ks?" And it wasn't something we knew how to do. And I just got on the phone and started calling TPAs and record keepers saying, "I've got these people who have plans and they'd like us to provide management on the plans. Can you help us?" And eventually we landed on Nationwide as our first provider. They had a solution for us. And I started going to conferences and meeting more and more record keepers. And as you know, this business is pretty small. And you start networking with people and you learn what's out there. And that was probably 15 or 20 years ago. And now we pretty much just we help advisors build retirement plan businesses in open architecture platforms.
Yeah, I've known quite a few advisors, and that's how they get into the 401k plan business. They have an advisory business, and then they have a client who loves what they're doing, and then all of a sudden, by the way, do you do 401k plans too? And the advisor isn't like the house cleaning company that says that we don't do windows. You always say, you know what, let me look into it, and if it's a great opportunity, let's go into it. And it's funny how everybody starts that way. When I started, people joke, how did you become an ERISA attorney? Well, it's the first job I got. I was hired by a small law firm affiliated with CPA, and, that's my answer. So in the 15, 20 years, this is a good question that I love. How have you seen the business change? Because I'm always a big fan of history of the business. When I started 22 years ago already, participants couldn't change their elections by the internet. They had to use by paper or by phone. How have you seen the business change since you started, working in 401k plans?
Well, clearly, because we provide managed accounts, we've seen managed accounts as an option in retirement plans that when we started, you couldn't even find those, other than something that was very passive and pretty much just an asset allocation. Target date funds were relatively new and just being adopted. But I think from a fiduciary standpoint, fiduciary scrutiny is far more obvious than it used to be. I think people pay more attention. Years ago, people didn't scrutinize, I don't think, fees as much, and most plan sponsors didn't worry about fiduciary liability. And now I think they do. Obviously, with Tibble versus Edison and the ramp up of more and more litigation, plan sponsors are more aware of it, so advisors are more conscious of it. So I think those are the big changes. I also think it seems that advisors have become more expert in this. There are fewer two-plan Tonys, so to speak. I think more and more the plans are gravitating to people who've sold more than just a couple of plans before.
Yeah, I mean, you make up great points. Number one, I used to always love when a plan sponsor wanted index funds back in the old days before fee disclosure. And people were, the TPA was trying to talk them out of it. Oh, it's too much money. It's more expensive, because they didn't explain the whole idea of revenue sharing,
Sure.
and that the fact that the active funds that they were pushing, they were paying revenue sharing, were actually more expensive and whatnot. But you also bring up, just a great point. The fiduciary concerns, that's not something that we always talked about. And, of course, the litigation with the Tibble cases, it makes it so much easier for plan sponsors to get sued. And it's just amazing, how the business has changed. And, one of the things that I've been a big fan of has been unbundled providers. I've always liked that. I just like choice. I always like checks and balances. When the custodian and the TPA are separate, or and the whole idea of proprietary funds, that was always a concern for me before litigation. So how do you look at the whole bundled, unbundled situation? Because you probably, as you said, you started out using bundled providers because that's who really was having that traction back, 15, 20 years ago.
It's interesting. There's a statistic out there that says that the vast majority of small to medium-sized plans go with those packaged solutions. And I'm convinced it's not because they have the lowest fees. It's not because they have the best investment lineups. It's really because they have distribution and they make things so simple. And certainly they have brand recognition. But the large plan space has been unbundled for a long time. The mega plans have been unbundled for a long time. They get consultants to come in. They do RFPs. They pull pieces together to build a plan. And the smaller plan space just hadn't embraced that. But I saw something years ago, and we actually use it in our presentation to advisors, and it's a list of some of the top retirement plan providers. And it's got Nationwide, Fidelity, Transamerica, John Hancock, and underneath all those names, and there's probably 20 names on that page, they have dates underneath each of those names. And I ask an advisor, do you recognize all those names? And they say, yeah. And I say, those are some of the biggest names in the retirement plan industry. And most plan sponsors would agree. You can't go wrong choosing any one of them. If somebody came to them and said, oh, this is the Principal, or this is a Nationwide plan, or Transamerica, or John Hancock, any one of them, they would say, oh, those are great. But can you guess what the dates underneath each of the names represent? And advisors never seem to know. Often they'll tell me it's when they won an award or when they were the top in the industry.
Right.
And I'll say, no, that's when they were recently sued by participants in a retirement plan. And it may not even when they were most recently sued. It just happens to be one I was able to find quickly. And I bring it up not because it's a surprise that big companies get sued. Big companies get sued all the time. And the idea that participants in a retirement plan might sue them shouldn't come as a surprise. But what surprises them is that these companies all use the same defense. They don't argue that the fees are appropriate or the investments are of high quality. They argue that we're not the fiduciary. And they've done a very good job positioning themselves to avoid that. And on the occasions when they're found to be a fiduciary, I'm certain they change their procedures going forward because they don't want to be a fiduciary.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite stories, I had a client who didn't have an advisor on the plan, and they were a $10 million plan, and one of the payroll providers was handling their plan. And they come to the meeting, and the local representative from this payroll provider brought one of his financial guys. And the financial guy says, by the way, you really should put in a small cap fund, but I'm not giving you advice because I'm not a fiduciary. But it was like, I used to always joke that it's the kind of the wink, like, yeah, I'm going to tell you something you should be doing, but you can't rely on me because I'm not a fiduciary. And they really go out of their way to say that they're not. They do a great job. But, when it comes to these big providers, there's so much room in the marketplace. McDonald's sells the most hamburgers in the United States, but don't tell me that they're better than Shake Shack or In-N-Out, because it's not happening. And, there's a marketplace for unbundled. And there are situations where bundled may make the best approach. I think, for example, multiple employer plans, and these PEPs that I've been talking about. And the better pricing really is from the bundled providers because they can afford the leeway in pricing that, some of the unbundled providers can't. But then again, I see some unbundled providers that, do charge a pretty great rate.
Well, the bundled provider, one of the benefits they have is really for startup plans because a lot of times their pricing it's so cookie cutter and easy. For a small startup plan, the advisor has a harder time going out and finding a TPA and a record keeper, and they just say, oh, it's easy. But I always say that's kind of like an incubator. And once that plan has grown to a certain size, you need to reevaluate. We've looked at plans, and it was probably a good plan when it started, but now it's 3 or 4 or 5 years later, and no one's reevaluated the fees, and you say, wow, look at this. This plan is now $5 million, and they're paying 2%. And they never should be paying 2% on a $5 million plan but it's because no one goes back. So it might have been priced right at the beginning, and it was perfect for a startup plan, and it was well designed. But if no one's doing the ongoing monitoring, then the plan really gets out of hand. One of the value adds that we try to do is when an advisor is going after a plan, I have them reach out to me, and we'll dig into the fee disclosure, and we'll do the benchmarking, and then we'll go back to them and say, here's what you need to say to unsell the plan, because chances are the plan sponsor is going to be defensive if you go in and tell them they got a bad plan. You need to go in and tell them this was a good plan 5 years ago, but your company has changed and our industry has changed, and we should monitor what's going on in your plan. The funniest thing, last week I was with an advisor. He had an appointment with a plan, and he brought me with him because we were going to be the 338. And we looked at the lineup, and I asked them, how often do you monitor the investments in this plan? And they laughed and they said, well, there was a guy here 8 years ago. And this was the investment committee I was meeting with. And there was a guy there 8 years ago, and that's who they were putting it on, that it was his job to monitor those investments, and they hadn't seen him in 8 years. And I thought, well, that's not atypical. I think that's what happens. A lot of plan sponsors, they set it up and they forget it.
Yeah, I always, my perfect example is I worked at a law firm. I was an associate, and the HR director said, oh, why don't you look at the plan? And I'm looking at the plan, and listen, I don't have a CFP, I'm not licensed, but I know a thing or two about mutual funds, and I'm looking at the list, and I'm like, my God, this is an old list. I mean, it was something like out of the late 90s, and this was, I think, in 2007 or something like that. And I said, well, who picked out these funds? and they're like, oh, well, the ERISA partner that we're no longer affiliated with, he picked out these funds about 10 years ago. And I said, you don't have an advisor plan? No, we don't. And I'm like, do you realize that you're going to get no protection on the ERISA 404C? And you're just in a lot of trouble. And, of course, they go through the process of hiring a financial advisor. And, of course, my grudge against them and why I always bring it up is because I gave them a list of advisors. And, of course, the HR director knew better and picked somebody that I didn't refer them to. So whatever. But that's always my grudge. But yeah, it's amazing, and I agree with you. You can't go into a plan sponsor and just be all negative. Negative doesn't sell. It's how can I put you in a better situation. It's all positive about yourself. So when I worked for a TPA that was kind of embroiled in a kind of a mini scandal, we had advisors around the country calling these plan sponsors up. Did you know so and so the TPA is all over the news, and I don't think an advisor got one plan out of that because. You get more out of sugar than you do with vinegar. Well, I forget the expression, but it's like going from a positive standpoint. Look where I could put you, and it obviously does a better job. Now, there's so much consolidation in the business, even on the RIA side. How do you see Q3 differentiating yourself amongst everybody else who's doing a 338? What are you doing? What do you see the business? How are you different than A, B, and C? Because I always feel that in order to stand out in this business, you actually have to stand out and focus on something that obviously the competition's not. And I'm not asking you to give me the secret formula and that sort of stuff.
Well, Ary, as I said, we're a money management firm first, and so our founder Brad Giamo, he was on the trading floor in New York for almost 2 decades, and so he learned a lot. He said it was the best classroom for learning to manage money. And then he built this company. We have CFPs on staff to manage a client account. But really what we do, even though we're money managers, is we help advisors build fee-based businesses, whether that's a retirement plan practice or whether that's a retail practice or a combination of both. So often we become the back office for a lot of advisors. So, for example, as I mentioned, I went out with an advisor last week to meet with a plan sponsor. It's his relationship, but we essentially do a lot of the research for him. He gets me the fee disclosure. We do the analysis of that fee disclosure. We come back with him with a variety of different record-keeping partners that we've vetted, and we say, here are their fees. We know there's a lot of great ones out there. And before we even get into putting together a lineup for them, we just say, here's a great low-cost partner that you can work with that's going to go in and be competitive on this plan. So in essence, we give them the talking points they might need to distinguish themselves. For example, I had a guy last year, he reached out to me and he sent me just a lineup. He typed it up in an email. He didn't send me a fee disclosure. He sent me the lineup. And he said, Greg, is there anything we can do with this? I have a meeting with this plan. And I looked at the lineup and it was all Vanguard Admiral shares. And I thought, oh, well, this is already going to be a low-cost plan. This is going to be tough to beat. From a fee standpoint, chances are they're not paying a lot in fees. So I said you need to talk to him about other things, other value adds you can bring to the table in your service. And he said, wow, he called me up and he said, I'm really surprised. I thought this would be a really expensive plan because it's with John Hancock. And I said, oh, it's with John Hancock? I said, can you get me the real fee disclosure? Because you sent me this list of funds when they're John Hancock is misleading. Because while John Hancock may call these Admiral shares, they aren't really Admiral shares.
Correct.
John Hancock has essentially, and John Hancock isn't unique in this, they have multiple different pricing structures based on the plan that are baked into the sub-accounts. And so he was able to then win this plan because he could show the plan sponsor, you could have these same funds.
But without the wrap.
without these added expenses.
Right.
And the vast majority of advisors don't understand that. Even though they know the business, they get blindsided the same way a client would when they see it's a Vanguard fund or they don't realize in this case that this person was paying 1.65 for a fund that they could have gotten for 10.
Yeah, you referenced earlier the two-plan Tony, which always reminds me. I always compare it to Barney Fife on the Andy Griffith show. He had that one unspent bullet in his pocket. That's the only bullet he had. and there's so many advisors, and I would go to the events and speaking, and you're talking to advisors that maybe have no plan on the books and just maybe one or two if we're lucky. I'm sure that's obviously a big part of the business. That I think that advisors, especially brokers who have one or two plans on the books, you just can't. The retirement plan business is something you can't dabble in. I'm sure when that client told you about 15, 20 years ago, when you consider the 401k plan business, you realize that you couldn't dabble in it. You realize that if you're going to go for it, you're going to go and focus on it.
Sure. Oh, that's true. And actually, it's funny because the same advisor who we helped with that John Hancock plan, he hadn't done a single plan. He'd been in this business for 30 years, and he had never done a retirement plan. And last year in January, he reached out to me one day because he'd stumbled on an opportunity. And he'd worked with us on his retail business, and he stumbled on this group plan, and he said, I noticed that you guys do something with this. Can you help me with this plan? And I looked at it, and I got him a proposal put together, and he said, I have to admit, I never wanted to approach this business because I didn't know the difference between what Transamerica brings to the table, or Principal, or Nationwide, or John Hancock. And so in my mind, if they had Nationwide, I was going to bring Transamerica. And if they had John Hancock, I was going to bring Principal. Because to me, they were all the same. And I understood that. I understood that mentality because it's hard to scrutinize plan providers because they do all look a lot alike.
Right.
And so when I did the open architecture discussion, and I showed him what it means to get a TPA, a record keeper, choose an investment lineup, and they are not tied to that investment lineup so that the providers are charging a flat fee or really low basis points and a flat fee, something that is not tied to the growth of the investments primarily. It made a lot of sense to him, and he suddenly found that he could distinguish himself, and he immersed himself, and then he closed 6 plans last year in his first year selling plans, but it was because he suddenly knew that he could distinguish himself from the other guy who happens to be knocking on doors selling Mass Mutual. I don't think an advisor should go in selling product. I think they should come in and sit down on the same side of the table with the plan sponsor and be a consultant and be a fiduciary, whether they're really a fiduciary or not, but do what's in the best interest of the plan sponsor.
Exactly. That's where the business has been moving for the last 10 or 15 years. So it's always surprising when you have some advisor, usually a broker, who just doesn't really understand that the days of where it was all about the trail they were going to get from the mutual fund company was the most important thing. It's been moving that way for years and years and years. You're based in Michigan with offices in Florida, correct?
Yeah, we have our home offices in Michigan. We've got regional wholesalers in different states, but we also have several wholesalers that travel out of the office here in Michigan.
Is it hard to, now with the internet and, obviously everybody's connected with each other, do you find that old plan sponsor, I only want to work with somebody in my local neighborhood argument anymore? Or?
Well, for us, the person they're working with is the advisor. We support the advisor. We can go on meetings if they want us to, but for the most part, it's the relationship is the advisor, and we're just essentially in the background, probably in much the same way you are. They hire you, but you don't have to be there necessarily. I mean, if it's a $100 million plan, you're going to make the trip. The average plan, you can do it just the way we're having this conversation right now. And for the most part, if the advisor is good, and most of them, they don't want us there. They just want our support.
Have you, with the advisors that you work with, have you explored, to me, I think one of the most unserved components of being an advisor, my joke has always been that I came in this business in 1998, and I said the only thing that hasn't changed is the participant enrollment meeting and the participant education meeting. I've seen, with a lot of them, I've seen a lot of funerals that have been more livelier.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever, instructed the advisors that you partner up with how to deal with that whole participant engagement process?
It's actually funny because I remember doing a presentation down in Florida to a group of advisors, and I was one of the presenters, and they had mutual fund companies before me, and then I was last, and I was talking about managed accounts. And after American Funds had spoken, and I don't remember who the other fund company was, I got up and I said, those were great presentations. And those companies have great mutual funds that would fit in most retirement plans. I said, but whenever you do an enrollment meeting, many of you do enrollment meetings in this room, what is the number one question you get asked after you've presented everything there is to know about mutual funds? And the question you get is, well, okay, you told me about all these mutual funds. What should I invest in? And I always say that's really where we fit, and that's where a managed account provider fits. One of our wholesalers years ago now was doing an enrollment meeting for a company that made ignition switches for cars. And he went to the meeting with our PowerPoint presentation. The advisor went first, talked about the lineup, and then our money management wholesaler got up to talk about managed accounts. And he said, Greg, I was nervous because it was my first time ever doing this in front of a room. And he had his laptop, and it was one of those laptops, Ary, that we've all had from time to time where the battery is going, so it's got to be plugged in.
Right.
Because if it doesn't plug in, it's out. And he walks into the break room where they're going to be doing this enrollment meeting, and he notices there's an outlet, but there's two vending machines plugged into the only outlet in the room. And he figures, well, they're not going to need the vending machines while I'm here, so I'm just going to unplug these vending machines and plug my laptop and projector in there, and the advisor will do his piece, and then I'll get up and do my piece, and everything will be great. And he said, just as he was getting up to do his presentation, he sees the HR woman in the back of the room tapping on her watch, and he knows he's got to get through this, and he gets about 2 slides in, and the screen goes blank. And he looks around and he notices that some guy had gone over and unplugged his laptop to plug in the vending machine.
Of course, that's what's important. That snack, the Dipsy Doodles is more important than the 401k enrollment meeting.
And he said, Greg, I could feel the sweat under my suit. I was so nervous because I knew that I'd never get my laptop booted up again in time and get back to my presentation. And he said, so it was a moment of inspiration. He said just that one moment where you suddenly knew what you needed to do. And he just asked, are there any NASCAR fans in the room? Now, you and I may or may not be NASCAR fans, but my wholesaler, Adam, was. And Adam said, are there any NASCAR fans in the room? And thankfully, the room full of people who made ignition switches had a lot of NASCAR fans.
I would think so, yeah.
And he asked, who has a fast car? And they start calling out names of drivers, Dale Earnhardt Jr., Jeff Gordon, I don't know, whatever. And he latches on to one of the names. He said, yeah, that guy has a fast car. It gets into the winner's circle a lot. Do you think you would do as well driving that car as Jeff Gordon does? And everybody laughed. Some people joked, yes, I would.
Yeah.
The reason I ask is because your employer has given you a high-performance investment vehicle for your retirement plan. You've got a great investment lineup. You can make changes every day that you want. You've got all kinds of research tools, and you can drive it yourself. So for those of you who think you can drive as well as Jeff Gordon, maybe you can manage money as well as a professional money manager. And for those of you who would like someone to help you, that's where we come in. We're a professional driver of your retirement plan. Said, you may not know this, but Jeff Gordon doesn't own the car he drives.
Right.
The owner hires him to do it because he'll do a better job. So for those of you who think you could do a better job, do it yourself. Here's the great lineup. And for those of you who don't, well, it turns out that approach to an enrollment meeting is much livelier than the boring slideshow that we typically did. So I said, I'm going to start using that enrollment presentation. And the next week, I was in Appleton, Wisconsin, at a treadmill company. They made treadmills, and I was with the advisor, and she got up, and I told her, I've got this great analogy I'm going to use. It's going to be great. I can't wait. And she said, okay, and she did the regular, here's what your plan is. And I got up, and I said, I just want to introduce this managed account service that we offer. And I asked, are there any NASCAR fans in the room?
Not one person.
And there were no NASCAR fans in Appleton, Wisconsin. And I said, oh, and I got nervous, and I just said, well, if there were any, and I did it anyway, And she came up to me afterwards, the rep, and said, I don't think you should use that analogy this afternoon. And so I was all set to do my regular presentation in the afternoon. And Ary, I don't know if you know what they are fans of in Appleton, Wisconsin, but as the room was filling up, I noticed around the room there were people who were wearing something that indicated their fandom. Can you guess what their
Green Bay
fans of?
Packers.
They're Green Bay Packers fans. And this happened to be when Brett Favre was the quarterback. And I said, it was my moment of inspiration. I told them, I'm from Detroit. We hope one day to have a professional football team. But you guys have a pretty good one. And I asked them about the team really quick. I said, tell me about your team. And everybody cheered. They all talked about their favorite players. And I said, yeah, but you've got one guy that controls the offense. He drives the team down the field. Do you think any of you could do as well as he does? And then I gave the same analogy, and it worked perfectly. You just transition. I'm sure we could come up with a baseball analogy that would be just as good. A few weeks later, I was in Alabama, just to tie this up with a bow, Ary. I was in Alabama doing the same meeting with a rep down in Alabama, and I got up and I said, I have two analogies. I have a football analogy and I have a NASCAR analogy. Which one do you guys want to hear? And this guy shouted out, do you know what the number one sporting event in Alabama is? And I said, Alabama-Auburn football game. And he said, Talladega 500. I said, all right.
Yeah, I would have gone with the Iron Bowl, but what do I know?
But to me, the enrollment meeting needs to be an engagement. And you can engage them far better with a story than you can with a boring slideshow. And so we encourage advisors to talk to their clients. But then nowadays, the other thing is technology's made enrollment meetings a lot different too. I know some of the record keepers we work with use Smart Plan or tools like that to do the enrollment meeting on someone's phone. I just met with an advisor who's calling on a $30 million plan sponsor, and he said to me, Greg, I don't know how I'm going to do enrollments. They have locations all over the country. And I said, you're going to have to lean on technology today because that's the way you do those.
Exactly. And I've always been a big fan. Speak to, people on their level. That's why I write my articles in English. And my joke is, there are two types of ERISA attorneys, those who speak English and those who speak ERISA-ese. And you got to, and I think it's just smart to understand who you're servicing. How you talk to a law firm is different than how do you talk to, let's say, a restaurant group. It's just the nature of the people that are there. And the whole point, I always say, is not to be hoity-toity to feel like you need to justify your fees, but rather to, speak in a language that participants and, of course, plan sponsors would understand on a level, that they certainly understand. Now, manage accounts. How have you seen that's something that, I think 10 years ago, that's not something that anybody ever talked about. Tell me the interest in managed accounts, how it works, and the fees and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's a good question. We realized that a lot of individual investors need help, and for us, while target date funds serve a purpose, they really disappointed during the bear market. People who thought, "Oh, I've got this fund and it's supposed to protect me," and then it was down just as much as the market was. A lot of investors were frustrated. One of the real values from a plan sponsor standpoint is when you add a managed account to the model, to the plan, we take on a fiduciary role. We sign with the plan sponsor as a 338 for our models if they're using us as a model provider. And that's something different than a target date fund could ever do because a target date fund wouldn't take on fiduciary liability. But beyond that, the participants want help and they want to know somebody's looking at their account. They don't want the idea that it's just passively allocated. More and more people want to know somebody is taking a personal interest in what they're doing. So in our case, we review accounts every Wednesday. All our accounts get reviewed every Wednesday. We reallocate if they need to be reallocated, and we make adjustments almost every week to the portfolio. So we'll hold a diverse mix of about 14 to 16 positions, and then we overweight strength. It's a diverse mix. It's a broad mix, and then we adjust as people get closer to their goal. So it takes into account not only their risk tolerance, but their time horizon. And as they approach their goal, similar to a target date, We get more conservative. But what's different from the target date is we have the ability to get defensive when the market starts to go down, and we have the ability to overweight the strength of the market when the market's trending up. It's far more proactive than the passive funds that people have in their portfolio.
So in terms of the clients, participants, how many are using managed accounts versus not managed accounts?
It really depends on the advisor and how it's presented, but we find that we get over 50% of the plans typically choose managed accounts. We've got some plans that it's 100% of the plan, but certainly over 50%. I was in a meeting years ago with a company, and they did home health care. So they had nurses that would go out.
Right.
And the owner of the company was who the advisor and I were meeting with. And the advisor said, the plan sponsor said, I don't know why we would need your service. And he started to regale me in all of his great investment knowledge. And he was telling me all the investments he makes. And he owned Berkshire Hathaway stock.
Right, of course.
Berkshire Hathaway meetings.
Yep.
And he was so smart. And after he was done, I said, it is clear that our service isn't for you because you like to do this. But the person who brought in the coffee, would she be as knowledgeable as you are about what to do? And he said, oh, no. And I said, our service is for someone like her. If you think about it, prior to 401k, in the 70s, everything was a DB plan.
Right.
And the plan sponsor would hire a money manager to manage the money to meet a goal. Then suddenly, with the birth of 401k, the plan sponsor said, all right, I don't have to hire money managers anymore. And I've got all these really smart people working on my factory who are going to be able to manage the money when we were paying someone to do it for us to meet goals. So to us, it's really just giving the participants the same opportunity that the plan sponsors took advantage of when they had DB plans. Hire somebody that's going to try and get you to your goal.
And that's why the fiduciary rule needed to be changed. I mean, a rule that was signed into law in 74 and was effective for 76. I mean, it's a completely different ballgame. And, back in those days, nobody had access to mutual funds. You had to know a broker, and you bought individual stocks, and you had to get on the phone. And it's amazing, in our lifetime, how the business is, constantly changing. So in conclusion, tell me how people can contact you for further information about Q3.
They can visit our website, q3tactical.com, or they can call our office. My number is 248-566-1122. If somebody would like us to analyze a plan, just send us a fee disclosure. We'll do all the back office work for you. We'll run lists of plans in your area, and we'll help you close business. If you're building a fee-based retirement plan business, reach out to us, and we'll show you what we can do.
Greg, I appreciate, and let's conclude our interview. Thanks.
Thank you, Ary.
Take care. So I want to thank Greg Reid, being one of our very few guests here on that 401k podcast. And of course, like he said, contact him through Q3 Asset Management. He gave some really great insight in dealing with plan sponsors and plan participants. So I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. And of course, go to that401ksite.com to sign up for that 401k National Conference and that 401k Conference in Houston, St. Louis, and Minnesota. Thank you.